All right, French grammar fans, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that might make some of you a little nervous. Impersonal and passive voice constructions.
And let me guess, you're probably prepping for that pronunciator certificate, right?
Bingo! But hey, even if you're not on the certificate path, these constructions are super useful for sounding more, well, French. More like a native speaker, you know.
Absolutely. They add that certain je ne sais quoi to your language.
Ooh, I like that. So what exactly are we dealing with here? Could you maybe give us a quick breakdown of what makes a construction impersonal or passive?
Sure. So in a nutshell, impersonal constructions often lack a specific subject performing the action. It's like saying it's raining in English. We don't need to say who is doing the raining, right? It just is.
Got it. Makes sense. And passive voice. That one always throws me for a loop.
Well, think of the passive voice as shifting the focus away from the actor and onto the action itself, or the thing being acted upon.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the light here. But let's get down to brass tacks. Can you give us a concrete example of how these impersonal and passive constructions actually play out in French?
Bien sûr. Imagine you're talking about, let's say, a masterpiece painting. In a typical sentence, you might say, Le peintre a créé ce tableau. The painter created this painting. Here, the focus is clearly on the painter, the subject doing the action.
Right, the painter's the star.
Exactly. But if you wanted to emphasize the painting itself, you could use the passive voice and say, Ce tableau a été créé avec passion. This painting was created with passion.
Ah, I see. Now it's all about the painting and the passion behind it. But I have to admit, the passive voice in French always makes my head spin a little. Is there like a formula I can use to remember how to build these sentences?
Well, think of it as a team effort. You've got the auxiliary verb être, to be, and the past participle of the main verb. They work together to create that passive vibe.
Être and the past participle. Got it. But isn't there something about agreement, too, like making sure things match up grammatically?
Absolutely. Just like any good team, they need to be in sync. So the past participle has to agree in gender and number with the subject of the sentence.
All right, that makes sense. So in your painting example, tableau is masculine singular, so créé stays the same, no extra E or anything.
You got it. And of course, you need to conjugate être to match the tense you're using.
Okay, so être plus past participle, that's our passive voice recipe. But hold on, are there other ways to express this idea in French? Sometimes things can get a little, how do you say, compliqué?
Absolutely. French is full of different ways to get your point across. One common alternative to the standard passive voice is using se faire, followed by an infinitive.
Se faire. Now that rings a bell.
For instance, you might say, Le voleur s'est fait arrêter. The thief got himself arrested. This construction often implies that something happened to the subject, sometimes even against their will.
So it's not just that he was arrested, it's like he kind of walked into it. There's a subtle difference there, right?
You're exactly right. It's all about nuance, and that's one of the things that makes French so fascinating, wouldn't you say?
I'm starting to think so. Before we wrap this up, could you give us a little sneak peek at some of the other alternatives to the passive voice?
Well, for one, don't underestimate the power of reflexive verbs.
Reflexive verbs. Okay, I'm listening.
For example, ce livre se lit facilement. This book reads easily. Here, se lit carries that passive sense without explicitly mentioning who's doing the reading. It's all implied.
It is slick. So we've got se faire plus an infinitive and reflexive verbs. And I'm guessing there's even more to discover.
Oh, there's always more. But I think that's a good place to pause for now.
Take a breather, folks. We'll be back with more impersonal and passive voice adventures after a quick break.
Welcome back, grammar enthusiasts. I hope you're ready for round 2 of our passive and impersonal voice extravaganza.
You bet. My brain's all warmed up and ready to tackle some more of those tricky French constructions. What's next on our agenda?
Let's dive into something you're bound to encounter in those pronunciator lessons. Using the passive voice with modal verbs.
Modal verbs. Yes, those little helpers that add all sorts of shades of meaning to our sentences. But how do they play nice with the passive voice?
It's actually pretty straightforward. You just add the infinitive of the main verb after the modal verb in its passive form.
Okay, so for example, if I wanted to say, this book must be read, how would that work?
Instead of on doit lire ce livre, you would say ce livre doit être lu. See how the modal verb devoir takes on that passive role, and the infinitive lire just follows along.
I think I'm getting it. So it's like the modal verb is calling the shots, saying this needs to happen, And the infinitive is just filling in the details of what that action is.
Exactly. And of course, those past participles are still hanging around, making sure everything agrees and gender and number.
Agreement.
Yep.
Right, can't forget about that. Okay, so modal verbs, check. Now, what about those pesky object pronouns? How do they behave in passive sentences?
Ugh, object pronouns, those little grammar gremlins.
Yeah.
But there's a simple trick to remember. In passive constructions, they always come before the auxiliary verb être.
Okay, hold on. Let me wrap my head around that. So if I wanted to say a letter was sent to me, how would I arrange all the pieces?
It would be une lettre m'a été envoyée. Notice how men, which represents me, comes before été envoyé.
Gotcha. It's like the pronoun is sneaking in before the action even happens. But I guess that makes sense, since in the passive voice, the focus is on what's being done, not who's doing it.
Precisely. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about how to express general opinions or preferences using both passive and impersonal structures.
Ooh, this sounds useful. Like taking everything we've learned and applying it to real-life situations. Give me an example.
Imagine you're talking about, say, a common belief in French society. You could say, Il est souvent dit que les Français aiment le vin. It is often said that the French love wine. We're using the passive voice to present a widespread opinion without necessarily naming who's doing the saying.
That's a smooth way to make a general statement without getting bogged down in specifics. And I bet I could use on for something like this too, right?
Absolutely. You could say, On pense souvent que Paris est la ville la plus romantique du monde. People often think that Paris is the most romantic city in the world.
On is like a magic wand for expressing general thoughts and feelings in French. But I'm curious, are there any other verbs that can step in for the passive voice, kind of like retenir does?
You're on a roll. And yes, there are a few others. Recevoir is a good one. Instead of the passive le cadeau a été reçu par Marie, you could say Marie a reçu le cadeau. It's more direct and active, but still conveys that same idea of receiving something.
Ah, that's so handy. Like a grammatical shortcut. Okay, what else have you got?
Let's talk about expressing necessity or obligation. You already know il faut, but there's another option that can spice up your French a bit.
Lay it on me. I'm always up for expanding my linguistic toolbox.
You can use il est nécessaire followed by a subordinate clause. So instead of il faut faire ses devoirs, you could say il est nécessaire que tu fasses tes devoirs.
Okay, it sounds a bit more formal, but definitely more elegant than just plain old il faut. Now, I have to ask, what about negative questions? Those always trip me up, especially with passive and impersonal constructions.
Negative questions can be tricky, that's for sure. But don't worry, there's a pattern to it. With passive constructions, just add ne pas around être. So, was the cake eaten? Becomes le gâteau n'a pas été mangé.
All right, that's not so bad. I can handle that. But what about with those impersonal constructions? Do they follow the same rule?
It depends on the construction. With il faut, you would put ne pas around falloir. So is it necessary to go? Becomes ne faut-il pas y aller?
Got it. So the key is to figure out which verb is the heart of the construction and then build a negative question around that. Makes sense.
Now, before we wrap up, any other burning questions you have about our dynamic duo, the passive and impersonal voices?
I think you've covered just about everything. My brain is officially full, but in a good way. Oh, but before we move on, do you have any of those quirky French idioms that use these constructions? You know, just for fun.
Of course. French idioms are a delight. One that uses an impersonal construction is il s'en est fallu de peu, meaning it was a close call.
Ooh, that's a good one. I could definitely see myself using that. All right, I'm ready for the grand finale. Hit me with your best advice on how to really master these constructions and impress pronunciator with my French skills.
All right, grammar gurus, ready for the final stretch of our passive and impersonal voice journey. Let's make sure you're fully equipped to ace that pronunciator challenge.
I'm all ears. What other secrets do you have in store for us?
Let's talk about weather expressions in French. You'll notice they often take on a very impersonal form.
Now that you mention it, I have noticed that. It's never really clicked, though.
Instead of saying the sun is shining, you'd say il fait beau. Literally, it makes beautiful. It's like the weather is this independent force just doing its own thing.
It's true. The weather doesn't really care about our plans, does it? It just is. Okay, so weather in French is often impersonal. What else?
Let's revisit a familiar friend, the il faut construction. It's essential for expressing necessity or obligation, but it can be tricky to master.
Oh, I know it. Il faut is one of those phrases I use all the time, but I'm never quite sure if I'm using it correctly. What are some common traps to avoid?
A big one is remembering that il faut is always followed by an infinitive. So you wouldn't say il faut que je fasse. You just say il faut faire. It is necessary to do.
Right. No sneaky subjunctive sneaking in there.
And keep in mind that il faut can express both general and specific necessity. For example, il faut manger pour vivre. One must eat to live is a universal truth.
Makes sense.
But il faut que j'aille au travail, I have to go to work, that's a specific obligation.
Okay, so the context helps us figure out if il faut is talking about a general rule or a specific to-do. Any other il faut wisdom you can share?
Sometimes, il faut doesn't translate directly to must or have to in English. It can also express a softer obligation, more like a suggestion.
Ah, interesting. So it's not always a strict command.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Il faut voir ce film might literally translate to you have to see this film, but it could just mean you should really see this film.
That's a good point. It's all about nuance.
Okay.
I'm feeling more confident about il faut now.
That's what we like to hear. Remember, the key to mastering these constructions is to pay attention to those subtle shades of meaning. Don't be afraid to experiment and see how different variations work in different situations.
That's great advice. Practice makes perfect, right?
Absolutely. And as you practice, you'll develop a deeper understanding of how these constructions work and how they can add depth and sophistication to your French.
Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly enlightening. I feel like I've leveled up my French grammar skills big time.
That's fantastic to hear. I'm confident you'll ace that pronunciator certificate with flying colors.
Thanks for the vote of confidence. And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring the fascinating world of French grammar. It's a journey full of surprises and rewards. Until next time, au revoir and bon courage.